A nation mourns. Washington, D.C. comes to a halt for the state funeral of former President George H.W. Bush. President Trump joins world leaders, dignitaries, and lawmakers who are paying their respects. Vatican reaction. As Pope Francis sends a message of condolence to the Bush family, we look back at the relationship between the Holy See and the 41st president. And a touching moment. Why the highlight of yesterday's broadcast came after it was over. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, December 5th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The nation says an emotional farewell to George H.W. Bush, America's 41st president, and celebrates his life and legacy at his state funeral in Washington today. Former President George W. Bush eulogized his dad, calling him a great and noble man. White House correspondent Mark Irons is outside the Episcopal National Cathedral, where today's funeral service was held. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. We heard several moving tributes to the late president's strength of character and public service, but the eulogy that stands out came from his eldest son, who shared their final conversation.
I said, "Dad, I love you, and you've been a wonderful father." And the last words he would ever say on earth were, "I love you too."
George W. Bush described his father as a man of quiet faith. In the National Cathedral congregation, President Trump and all living former U.S. presidents, including 94-year-old Jimmy Carter. Foreign leaders, diplomats, and clergy from different faiths, including Washington's former Archbishop, Cardinal Donald Wuerl. The state funeral started with prayer.
With faith in Jesus Christ, we receive the body of our brother George.
The 41st president's granddaughters read from Isaiah.
For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of mourning shall be ended.
Presidential historian John Meacham called Bush the last great soldier statesman, highlighting his career from a Navy cockpit to the Oval Office.
He believed that to whom much was given, much is expected. And because life gave him so much, he gave back again and again and again.
Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada, predicted how history will remember George H.W. Bush.
I believe it will be said that no occupant of the Oval Office was more courageous, more principled, and more honorable than George Herbert Walker Bush.
President George W. Bush choked up at the end of his eulogy when speaking about his mother, Barbara, and his sister, Robin, who lost her fight to cancer when she was 3 years old.
So through our tears, let us know the blessings of knowing and loving you, a great and noble man, the best father a son or daughter could have. And in our grief, let us smile knowing that Dad is hugging Robin and holding Mom's hand again.
The former president is back in Texas tonight, where his body will lie in repose at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston. A funeral will take place there tomorrow before his burial at his presidential library in College Station, Texas. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. And before the funeral, mourners on Capitol Hill gave their final salute. George H.W. Bush is the 12th president to lie in state inside the Capitol Rotunda. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi brings us the story.
A national day of mourning, capping 3 days of remembrance in Washington. Inside the Capitol Rotunda, Senator Bob Dole saluted his friend and once fierce rival for the 1988 GOP presidential nomination. Senator Johnny Isakson, a Republican from Georgia, tells me he learned a lot from the late president, who was a mentor.
He was a
true role model type of a person if there ever was. His humility was one of the main things. It was the welcome mat to sit down and talk to him. And then his willingness to talk to people that folks say you shouldn't talk to them. He thought you should talk to everybody and try to give them a chance to come be a part of the fold.
This morning, the body of George H.W. Bush left the Capitol for the last time. Mourners lined the streets in 36-degree weather as the motorcade went by.
His lifetime of service, literally from his teenage years and devoting his entire life to the service of this nation. And it's my prayer that younger generations will see that it's such an honorable pursuit to serve this nation.
And the younger generations joined in the goodbye.
I want them to know about leaders that have come before and talk to them about his integrity and humility, his service to our country, his love of family and of his wife.
National Right to Life praises Bush for being a pro-life president. He did veto 10 pro-abortion bills. Karl Rove says earlier, though, Bush Sr. gradually came over to the pro-life camp, especially when he read the number of abortions here in D.C. exceeded live births. Lauren?
With the period of mourning nearing its end, Jason, let's look forward. What is Congress going to address next?
Lauren, Congress has to pass a spending bill to keep some government agencies open. Supporters of a criminal justice bill in the Senate say they do have the votes for passage. Now, that bill includes giving judges more flexibility in sentencing, but there's no vote scheduled yet.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. George H.W. Bush was known as the last foreign policy president. During his one term in the White House, he saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union crumble. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. George Bush Sr. was the last person elected president with any prior foreign policy experience. He entered the White House with one of the most impressive resumes and left with an impressive list of achievements.
I, George Bush, do solemnly swear.
George H.W. Bush will forever be remembered as president and a lifelong public servant. Bush was the last president to fight in World War II. The son of a senator, the native New Englander was the man with the golden resume who rose through the political ranks.
George Bush, the man for the United States Senate.
Despite losing his race for Senate in 1964, Bush was elected congressman 2 years later. In 1971, President Richard Nixon appointed him ambassador to the UN. Despite voicing differences with China's communist government, Bush advocated for friendly relations. He would later serve as envoy to China under Gerald Ford. That made an impression on the Chinese people. This man praises George H.W. Bush and credits him with improving ties. Bush would go on to serve as director of the CIA, all valuable experience that helped him get on Ronald Reagan's ticket as vice president. His foreign policy experience served him well as president. Bush led the country at a time of great global change, including the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. During the Iraq crisis of 1990 to 91, President Bush built a coalition to push Saddam out of Kuwait. He lost his second bid for president to Bill Clinton, but they would go on to become friends, working for charities that serve the poor around the world. As the nation mourns his loss, he leaves behind a rich legacy of public service.
President Bush was known for carefully planning what action he would take before making a decision on key issues like liberating Kuwait. Bush would also go on to write in his diary, "I hope I'm seen as steady, prudent, and able." Lauren?
President Bush faced, I remember, enormous pressure when it came to all of these global issues. But he often seemed humble, and I know it was important for him to be that way.
Yes, Lauren, President Bush is often described as prudent, and even through tough campaigns like against Ronald Reagan in 1980, he made it a point not to attack his family for political gain. In more recent years, of course, Bush is remembered for spending his time volunteering. Lauren?
Wouldn't be prudent. That was part of an SNL skit that went down in history. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. The Holy Father is saddened to learn of the death of former President George Bush. In a telegram, Secretary of State Pietro Parolin writes, Pope Francis offers heartfelt condolences and the assurance of his prayers to all the Bush family. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliette, how were relations between the U.S. and the Vatican during President Bush's term?
Lauren, the two met twice at the Vatican when Bush was in office, once in May 1989, the second time in November 1991, and the Berlin Wall fell, as we know, in 1989, so the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union were the backdrop for much of Bush's presidency. A common goal for both the U.S. and the Vatican at the time was creating a stable post-communist Europe, and John Paul II had lived under both Nazism and communism in his native Poland, where the Catholic Church was greatly oppressed. The Polish Pope was vehemently anti-communist, as you will remember, and he was especially opposed to atheism, which he said was so detrimental to human dignity and authentic freedom. Now, in that, they found a lot of common ground with the Reagan-Bush administration. And as Vice President, Bush was a key figure in helping President Ronald Reagan fight the Soviet empire.
How is President H.W. Bush being remembered today and this week in Rome?
Lauren, I spoke with Father John Walk, who worked in the Bush 41 administration before becoming a priest, and he says the united front presented by the Holy See and the U.S. against communism was remarkable. President Bush and JP2 were known to have a good relationship, and when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, setting off Gulf War #1, the Vatican didn't show strong opposition. Now, remember, both Bush Sr. and Jr. came to Rome back in 2005 for the funeral of John Paul II, and the U.S. Embassy to Italy has opened a condolence book for Bush 41. Diplomats living here are encouraged to sign it, and at the embassy, the American flag is flying at half-staff today, Lauren.
How did President Reagan's relationship with Pope John Paul influence President Bush's relationship with the Vatican?
Well, Reagan and JP2 had a very strong bond throughout the 80s. Reagan was a Presbyterian, and he had a lot of affection for the Holy Father and for the Catholic Church. The two met at the Vatican behind closed doors in 1982, and that, Lauren, was the first time in history that a U.S. president and a pope met alone. The U.S. established diplomatic ties with the Holy See that same year. And George H.W. Bush was vice president at the time and an expert in foreign policy. And when Ronald Reagan died in 2004, John Paul II sent a tribute recognizing his, quote, unwavering commitment to the cause of freedom. Bush inherited that long-standing cooperation when he succeeded Reagan as president in 1988.
Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Coming up, we continue our look back at the life and legacy of former President George H.W. Bush. Flags in Kosovo fly at half-staff today to mark a national day of mourning for George H.W. Bush. He is honored for the support he gave to ethnic Albanians in the former Serbian province. Kosovo's Minister of Education instructed all morning classes to be devoted to the late president. In and out of the White House, George H.W. Bush was a pro-life supporter. Joining me now, Chuck Donovan, president of the Charlotte Lozier Institute, served for a brief time in the George H.W. Bush administration as director of presidential correspondent. Welcome to our broadcast.
Great to be on the program.
We've heard a lot about how thoughtful George H.W. Bush is, how important faith is to him. How did that aid him in receiving and communicating the pro-life message?
Well, early in his career as a private citizen and a campaigner for the White House in 1980, he had indicated a pro-choice stance. But during the 1980 campaign, when approached by President Reagan as to whether he would join him as vice president, they talked about the life issue and whether President Reagan's position would prevail. With George H.W. Bush being a man of honor, he went and studied the issue and became increasingly pro-life, and I think had a very consistent pro-life vice presidency and presidency.
You say it was really this relationship that cemented the GOP as pro-life.
Well, no question about that. You know, it was viewed at the time that President Reagan was a member of the reform conservative wing of the party. There was an establishment wing represented by Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller. Bush would have been classified in that group, but when the two of them came together, basically left no room in the party for any position but the embrace of the sanctity of all human life.
He walked the walk, he talked the talk for the rest of his life. I want to read this letter from March of 1989, where he declined to meet with Planned Parenthood representatives. He wrote, "I do not favor advocating abortion in any way, shape, or form." And he references friends who encouraged him to have the meeting, writing, "They all remain close friends, though we do differ on the abortion question." This seems to speak to his ability to stand his ground without being venomous.
He did that, and I think you saw all the respect at his funeral service today, from across the spectrum. He was resolute on life. He vetoed 10 bills out of Congress, including a massive funding bill, because it weakened pro-life protections. But he did it in such a way that he kept his support from, I think, across the political spectrum. He was a man of honor, and it showed in all of his life's dealings.
He vetoed an entire labor HHS spending bill when Democrats sought to loosen the Hyde Amendment. And for those who do not know, the Hyde Amendment prohibits federal Medicaid dollars from covering abortion except in cases of rape, incest, or life endangerment. How important was that at the time?
Well, it was huge because the Hyde Amendment was under severe assault. And as we knew, with the next administration of President Clinton, if they had had their preference, they would have repealed it. But he held his stance. Congress saw he wasn't going to back down, so for the duration of his presidency, the Hyde Amendment, which our institute has found saves 60,000 lives a year, was something he stood square for, and I think it's a testament to his character and his commitments.
Before we go, you knew the man. Your final thoughts?
Well, I got to meet him only a couple of times at the annual March for Life meetings in the White House. I would describe him as a listener. He heard President Reagan on the issue. He came closer and closer to his positions. Maybe not as eloquent as Reagan was, but at the end of the day, I think he was a stalwart individual and someone we can admire for his service to this country. It's inestimable.
Thank you so much. Chuck Donovan with the Charlotte Lozier Institute.
My pleasure, Lauren.
Prosecutors say one of President Trump's former national security advisors should not do any prison time. They say Michael Flynn cooperated extensively with the probe into possible collusion with Russia in the 2016 election. The former U.S. Army Lieutenant General has been interviewed 19 times. He pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. Officials say San Diego has seen a slight uptick in families entering the U.S. illegally since the caravan of Central American migrants arrived in Tijuana 2 weeks ago. Agents are processing roughly 100 requests for asylum per day. Thousands of migrants remain at the border, some trying to cross over undetected. Up next, as Washington, D.C. says goodbye, my personal memories of former President George H.W. Bush.
Il primo passo per pregare è essere umile.
Pope Francis says during Advent, we must ask Jesus to teach us to pray. The first step is humility, he says. Today, Francis started a new series of talks on the Our Father. The Pope says the Gospels offer a vivid portrait of Jesus as a man of prayer. My heart is sad today for the passing of two beautiful souls, my Aunt Bev, who I adored, and the 41st President of the United States. And it's amazing to me that both shared similar gifts. As his son, George W., so eloquently said today at his funeral, he lived life to the fullest, looked for the good in each person, was a true and loyal friend with an enormous capacity to give. He was generous, loving, and sustained by the love of the Almighty. I had the privilege of interviewing 41 at his Texas library years ago. He showed me around the father and son exhibit and invited me to his private residence where I met Barbara Bush. Wearing her signature pearls, she asked me where I was from. Very lovely. And I told her our often repeated family story of the day when I brought my parents for a tour to the White House while he was president. It was below zero, and my father put on his pajamas under his clothes to stay warm. She asked for a piece of paper immediately and wrote my parents this note. Dear Ellen, I'm so enjoying your daughter. Have a great year, Barbara Bush. And the postscript, no PJs in the White House. Of course, we have that framed in my parents' home. Mr. Bush then showed me around the grounds and pointed to a plot of land and said, "Here's my last stop. May you rest in peace, Mr. President. God bless you and your family. And tomorrow I'll be at the Pittsburgh funeral of my Aunt Bev, who wasn't famous, wasn't part of a political world, but shared those qualities of love and decency we heard about at today's Washington National Cathedral." Finally tonight, we've had enough emotion as a country, I think. It's been a somber, somber week, especially here in Washington, D.C. But one moment yesterday after the broadcast gave me a much-needed smile. I had the great privilege of receiving a visit from Marita Four. She's from Pennsylvania, just like me, was in town visiting her sister Mary. We met in the green room that we reserved for our guests, and it had been a really busy day. I've seen the green room that crowded, but never so happy. Marita is a big fan of EWTN and News Nightly. Hi, Marita. She likes tennis and bocce ball and has been active in the pro-life movement since she was little. Marita is having some health problems with her vocal cords, and her family asks if we could keep her in your prayers. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and at Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. We end tonight with more of today's tributes for former President George Herbert Walker Bush. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord. Good night, and God bless you.